Hi. I had a request to talk about Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the time period after the Civil War. In fact, some people actually say it starts during the Civil War, um, and it lasts till about 1877. The Civil War ends in 1865. Those who say that Reconstruction starts in the middle of the Civil War oftentimes cite 1862 with the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation to take effect on January 1st, 1863, as the actual start of Reconstruction. But the purpose of Reconstruction, first of all, different historical figures have different purposes with Reconstruction, but the purposes of Reconstruction are to do things like reunite the country, help the freed slaves, rebuild the economy, because we have to remember uh, the South's economy is in shambles. There have been many, many battles through the South. Atlanta has been decimated. Richmond had been decimated. Many of their big towns have been fought through, and sometimes even severely damaged. So their economy is in shambles. Plus, much of their economy relied on slave labor. And to have lost that much property damaged their economy. But of course, that property is humans, and that is something that is reprehensible. The ideas of Reconstruction are different based on different historical figures. I put up a few people up here. Number one is Abraham Lincoln, the president, up until his assassination in April of 1865. He has a 10% plan, which is very, very lenient. He wants the southern states to be able to come back into the Union as soon as 10% of them, 10% of the voters, take an oath of loyalty to the country. And Abraham Lincoln, he didn't want a hard peace. He wanted to pick the South up off the ground, dust them off, and let them back into the Union. He wants emancipation, as seen by the Emancipation Proclamation, which not only frees the slaves, but also allows African Americans into the Union Army. Frederick Douglass had been arguing for that for a while. And he also, at his last speech that he gives before he's assassinated, he talks about limited suffrage. He says that the educated African Americans and those who had served in the military, are in the military, should have the right to vote. So limited suffrage. And although it is limited, he's the first president ever in U.S. history to actually say that African Americans should have the right to vote. So it is a step in the right direction there. Congress. Thaddeus Stevens is one of the more dominant members of Congress. The Republican Party controls Congress during this era. Many of them are called radical Republicans, or by their detractors as black Republicans, because they support African American voting rights. The most famous, Thaddeus Stevens, was even rumored to have been secretly married to his house servant, who was an African American lady, which was a big scandal back then. But Thaddeus Stevens and many of the Republicans in Congress, they didn't want the 10% rule. They wanted majority. They wanted most of the Southerners, most of the voters in the South to have to take an oath of loyalty before their state could come back in. They want martial law, which means they want the army down in the South, basically controlling the South, enforcing federal policy. And they want more help for freed slaves than what they're actually going to get. Andrew Johnson, he becomes president after Lincoln's assassinated. Now, Andrew Johnson was not the vice president in the first term. Lincoln gets assassinated very early, 1 month into his second term. So Andrew Johnson had barely been vice president. He had actually only talked to Lincoln a few times. And Andrew Johnson talks about more pardons, less assistance to blacks. In fact, there's bit of a debate. Thaddeus Stevens wants to build schools for African Americans. He wants to take land away from the rich white plantation owners, carve up that land, and give it to the blacks. Johnson fights that and vetoes that and stops that. And Johnson talks about how we spent so much money fighting the Civil War. It would be a waste to spend more money building schools for the freedmen and things like that. And he's certainly not a supporter of the Freedmen's Bureau, an organization designed to help do this assistance for the transition between being a slave to being free. Unfortunately, most African Americans who have been freed go into sharecropping. Most of them go back to work for their former master. They are forced to sign these contracts, and these contracts are just arduous and extremely exploitative of the workers. Most of your labor is actually going to end up going towards your former master. Most of that labor, you know, you work hard, and there's all these clauses in the contract where they can hit you and fine you more, and you have to do a certain amount of work for your master, your former master, and but you know, think about it. If you're a freed slave, you know, you probably were illiterate in many areas. It was illegal to teach a slave to read or write. You don't know a lot of skills other than manual labor on a farm for many of them, and you don't have money because slaves don't really accumulate much money, and you know, what are your options? So many of them just go back to where they know, where my friend's going to be, where my family's going to be, where my parents might be buried. And so they go back to where they know. And unfortunately, many of them live for a few generations in the sharecropping system, which is extremely exploitative. You know, perhaps there would have been much better economic circumstances for the freedmen had they taken Thaddeus Stevens' plans about giving each African American head of household some land and money to build a cabin. Political gains. There are some political gains for African Americans during Reconstruction. They do gain the right to vote, but as we're going to talk about later, it is temporary. And some African Americans are elected to the state level and national level Congresses. In fact, 2 states temporarily have more African American Congress members than white Congress members at the state level, not the national level. So there are some political gains. However, the KKK forms. The KKK is a terrorist organization. It starts in the South of Confederate veterans. They claim to be a charitable organization at first. They quickly are doing terrorist acts. They try to suppress African Americans to try to keep them from enjoying political rights, economic rights, their freedoms after they've been freed at the end of the Civil War. And so the KKK is just haunts the South. And they don't just go after African Americans. They often go after white Northerners, especially the carpetbaggers. The carpetbaggers, you know, named after those suitcases made out of carpet. And the Northerners quickly move. Some of them move down towards the South at the end of the war to build businesses, start companies. And they're looked down upon by Southerners. They're seen as exploiting the misfortune of the South having lost the war and having so many businesses destroyed. And so the KKK targets blacks, but they also target white Northerners in the South too. I remember seeing a KKK posters put up to intimidate people, which is the point of their terrorist organization. And the poster was threatening white Northerners. There was like 3 or 4 KKK guys lynching a white man, and the white man had on his shirt Ohio written across it. President Grant, he's the second president here after Lincoln. It goes Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and then Grant. And President Grant here actually temporarily bans the KKK. It passes a force act to make it illegal so he can use military force to basically go after the KKK and disband them. Later they do come back. In fact, they come back strong in the 1920s in the North. Unfortunately, pretty big in some areas of Michigan, even in Indiana and other northern states. Successes of Reconstruction. Most people who point to the successes say, well, you got the temporary success of a lot of political gains and voting rights. But the most obvious successes of Reconstruction are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment is actually what Abraham Lincoln was working on when he was assassinated. The movie Lincoln by Spielberg that came out was talking about that. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation very well might have been illegal. It was highly possible that the court could have found the Emancipation Proclamation illegal. Does the president have the right to essentially, take away property? And remember, Abraham Lincoln had, argued that that he had this right because of the wartime powers, but it wasn't guaranteed. There were people who were challenging this, and so Lincoln knew he needed a 13th Amendment. Plus, even with the Emancipation Proclamation, not all the slaves would have been freed. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in rebel areas, which was most areas, which would have covered the majority of slaves, but not all of the slaves. So the 13th Amendment was extremely important to pass. The 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship if you are born here. It does a variety of things. Also, the other most famous thing is it guarantees equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment is an amendment that's actually used a lot today. And I think a lot of the people who wrote the law didn't realize how far lasting it would be into the future. I don't think they realized that, and how much it would spread out to cover a variety of things today. And it's still being used in the courts today to expand rights and civil liberties to this very day. The 15th Amendment is voting rights. You can't deny voting rights to African Americans because that's often what was going on back then. For example, the 14th Amendment, they make the law that you're a citizen if you're born here, because a lot of the southern states started to pass laws to say that African Americans could not be citizens. I mean, that's the whole point why this comes about during the Civil War. And keep in mind, too, after Lincoln's assassinated, Andrew Johnson, he was from the South. He was from Tennessee. He was a Democrat. He was the only loyal Southern Democrat U.S. Senator. That's why Lincoln chose him for his campaign for his second term. And he wanted to show national unity, part of this Reconstruction. But the problem is when Lincoln's assassinated, then you're left with a Southerner at heart who doesn't really care much for trying to help the African Americans who've just been freed, which is going to lead to a lot of tensions between Johnson and the Republicans in Congress. And we get to the failures. Most historians see Reconstruction as a failure because it lasts till 1877, then it's kind of done away with, and it just doesn't. Most of it just really doesn't take effect. You look at the Hayes-Tilden election. Republican Hayes wins a very controversial election against Democrat Tilden in the 1876 election. And, there's all these electoral votes up in dispute. They form a commission. The commission gives every single one of them to Hayes, so he just barely wins by one. Hayes had said he would pull the military out of the South and give the South more freedom and leeway to run itself, and then he follows through on that, and he promises he'll follow through on that when the South and the Democrats give Hayes the election, this disputed election. Remember, the Republicans back then were dominant in the North, the Democrats were dominant in the South, so most of the South would have been voting for Tilden, most of the North would have been voting for Hayes. And you see a lot of failures because you see black codes, and then you see the Jim Crow laws designed to oppress and keep down African Americans to prevent them from enjoying the rights that they have. In the Southern economy, it lags it's sluggish for decades, and so you don't really see a big economic improvement either. One thing that's important to look at is why most historians say Reconstruction is a failure is because, you're a slave, then you're given your freedom, and then you have the right to vote and do this and that. Then when Reconstruction ends in 1877, the vast majority of African Americans lose their right to vote due to these black codes and Jim Crow laws and all these ways the literacy test, the poll tax, and things like that to prevent African Americans from voting. You really don't see African Americans voting in big numbers again until the 1960s, almost 90 years later with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act under LBJ. So most historians see Reconstruction as a failure. And it's a very, very vital time period in our nation's history because, the wounds of the Civil War are very, very, very deep. Over 600,000 Americans are estimated to have lost their life. Some people even say it potentially over 800,000 with some modern research right now. But, the wounds are very, very, very deep. The tension's still there, and it lingers on for decades. And Reconstruction is very, very, very important. And a lot of historians feel like it was not effective and should be looked at as a failure because we do not give African Americans their rights for very long after Reconstruction ends. They lose their voting rights for decades.